What is a Metroidvania game? To define them, Metroidvania games combine platforming, exploration, role-playing, and customization mechanics, and combat together into a sprawling adventure. Metroidvania is regarded as a high genre, despite having a low budget in comparison to more mainstream genres of games such as first-person shooters. Games made in this genre have their own identity and are thoughtfully made productions. The Metroidvania genre was popularized by the games Super Metroid and Castlevania: Symphony of the Night. These games that in both their series shone out and showed what could be done with these qualities. I will also discuss Hollow Knight, a modern addition to this genre. These games adopt genres to create a theme. Super Metroid is science fiction which can be seen through the imagery of aliens and spacesuits. However, there are two Metroidvania subgenres, which are those that have the range combat seen in Metroid titles and those that have closer-up combat seen in Castlevania titles, such as Hollow Knight. Since combat is one of the biggest variable aspects of these games, it is appropriate to categorize these games amongst the combat style of the two series that popularized the genre. Uses and gratifications theory asks, what do people do with the media? This suggests that media has a purpose to obtain a fulfillment. People play Metroidvania games to evade one's current situation or environment, or escapism, since these games are set in worlds of their own, different to a potentially displeasing reality. In the games Super Metroid and Hollow Knight, you play as masked characters whose face is never shown. This helps the audience envision themselves as the character and identify with them. Super Metroid could only be played on the Super NES. Later, it had been re-released onto more modern consoles including the 3DS and the Switch. It was re-released so that a new generation who most likely don't own a retro console but do own the current console could play a retro game which still holds up. Super Metroid was developed by Nintendo. Nintendo isn't just a game developer, they also develop their own consoles and therefore are competitors to Sony and Microsoft. Metroid is the intellectual property of Nintendo, who don't want their games to release on other consoles, which is why it doesn't appear outside of Nintendo consoles. Modern Metroidvania games, however, aren't limited to one console. Hollow Knight is available on 4 different platforms: the PS4, the Xbox One, Switch, and PC. This is because Hollow Knight is an indie game. An indie game is created by a single or small group of individuals without significant support from a publisher. Hollow Knight was developed by Team Cherry, who aren't owned by a publisher or console developer. This means that they have the freedom to release their game onto any platform they want. The gaming audience is fragmented because there are console-exclusive games such as Death Stranding on the PS4, which would persuade someone to buy that console over the others which they can't play that game on. So, by releasing Hollow Knight on multiple platforms, Team Cherry allow themselves to have a wider audience. Arguably, Super Metroid contains many NPCs or non-player characters. However, these are limited to the enemies, bosses, and characters of little significance. For example, the Etacoons, which appear briefly to show the player a control. The player is unable to interact with them outside of watching what they do. Unlike Super Metroid, Hollow Knight doesn't have 90s technological restraints, and contains many NPCs which have a variety of functions, which include merchants, quest givers, and many more. Take the Last Stag for instance. The Last Stag is an NPC which the player must summon by ringing a bell. The player can talk to it, and also use it to travel from one area to another. This is a modern interactive form of world building which helps to create a larger, absorbing world. This interactivity within the game is another way in which the audience can achieve escapism, as by communicating with the NPCs, they are actively participating with the game world, and are therefore being further absorbed into it. Super Metroid was released in the early 90s on the Super Nintendo, and this does show. By looking at the graphics, you can see that the art style could only go so far with the technology that was used to create the game at the time. Metroidvania games in more recent years are made using better modern software for modern gaming platforms like the PS4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, and PC. Modern platforms are built with far more powerful components that weren't around during the development of Super Metroid. This technology has allowed developers to go beyond the pixelated graphics of the early 90s and create stylized games with their own unique look. In Super Metroid, there are 3 endings, and these can be achieved depending on how long it takes for the player to finish the game. However, in Hollow Knight, there are 5 endings depending on the actions the player takes during the game. This is because the modern technology used to make Hollow Knight didn't exist to be at the disposal of Nintendo during the development of Super Metroid. 2 of Hollow Knight's endings can only be achieved if the player owns the DLC, or downloadable content, which adds more content to the copy of the game. While precursors existed, DLC wasn't around in '97, so once games were released, that was the entire game. With DLC not being around 23 years ago, developers couldn't add more content to their games. A modern Metroidvania such as Hollow Knight isn't restrained to dated, time-based mechanics, but instead allows the player to make actions and choices which will affect the outcome of the story. For example, by defeating the optional final boss, the Radiance, the player unlocks the 3rd ending, which has its own cutscene which plays upon the defeat of the Radiance. This is an interactive feature of the game which helps to absorb the player into the game world, as the cutscene is immediate feedback which shows the player defeating the Radiance was the causality of this outcome. In conclusion, the Metroidvania genre has developed alongside the technology that is used to develop and release them. The Metroidvania genre is still young, having only been around for about 30 years, and developers taking advantage of the current technology at their disposal has shown within this short space of time the visual quality of these games go from retro pixelated graphics into stylish works of art. Initially, developers wanted to convey a compelling story which adopted a specific set of game mechanics, despite feeling linear due to their game's lack of interactivity. This worked because the developers succeeded in making fun and challenging games. Today, developers add interactive mechanics to their Metroidvania games in order to exceed the limitations of the game before it, by giving the player the freedom in how they interact with the game world around them, while still upholding the necessary mechanics that make a Metroidvania a Metroidvania.